So welcome back, everybody. Did anyone think of any questions while they were at lunch or coming or going? Yvonne has a couple.
Yeah, I had questions about the topic of lying and how that sometimes accompanies addiction, and for some maybe obvious reasons, but I'm wondering about how you see it and how you work with that.
Okay, so Yvonne wants to know about the topic of lying. Addicts, alcoholics, lying. You know, there's a joke in AA about how can you tell if an alcoholic's lying? You know, their lips are moving. Yeah, and so this is a concept that's very important in addiction and recovery. And we're going to talk a little bit later more about honesty. Yeah, but this is a great topic. When the AA got started, as I mentioned, most of the people that were getting into recovery were people, middle-class white guys, that were truly becoming rehabilitated. And these days, there's a lot of people that end up addicted that actually need to be habilitated. And there's a huge difference, and it has a lot of implications for us as therapists, and also for how well the 12-step tenets work for people. And when I'm working with people, and I have this suspicion that I may not be getting the whole story, or what I'm being told is not accurate. And a classic one would be, you know, how you doing? Have you been using? Oh no, I'm good. You know, and sometimes that doesn't happen to be true. So the first thing I try and do is not be all judgmental and self-righteous, which sometimes I'm good at, and sometimes louder, and sometimes not as good. But there's a lot of different reasons that people lie. And remember that fifth step, the exact nature of our wrongs? This is a topic that fits in with that. What is my lying about? Am I trying to protect my ability to use, which would be a very common one? Do I have so much shame? And I think this happens in therapists' offices all the time, is the person we're talking to wants help, but they're too ashamed to be real with us, including, I don't want to let you down. You know, I want help, but I have a problem, but I don't want you to think poorly of me. And so what we have to do is try and get a sense of the causation, of the exact nature. What's underneath this? Is it shame? Is it guilt? Is it trying to get over? You know, do I have someone in my office that is really just checking off the boxes for the PO or for the parent or for the boss, and I'm not really making any connection with them? There's other people who their lying is closer to pathological, and the people who would lie when the truth would do. And they've gotten to a point, you know, they're not even particularly aware of when they're lying or not. And as we get into the 9th and 10th steps, we're going to be talking about that in a little more detail. Because as long as a person is lying, unless they're a sociopath, and that's another thing, today we're seeing more people with that are sociopaths or narcissistic, that are not necessarily in politics, that they're not likely to be helped by me. They're not likely to be helped by 12-step stuff because it's more of a Axis 2 type diagnosis rather than an Axis 1, so it's not likely to be terribly changeable. We might be able to work some around the edges, but we're not really going to get to the core emotional things which we'd like to do. But the thing is, if a person's lying and they're not a sociopath or way narcissistic, they're going to have shame and guilt, and they're going to have anxiety about the lying. So a huge part of this thing they call recovery is helping people become competent at not lying anymore. Help them to come to understand, how come I'm lying? I'm lying because I'm afraid of women's anger. Oh, okay, I don't need to be afraid about that. I'm not getting hit by the bus. You know, I'm experiencing, you know, somebody saying, you know, you didn't do your dishes is, you know, you're an asshole. And really they're saying you didn't do the dishes. And, you know, how do I get right size, and how do I have right size responses to things, rather than, well, you know, I couldn't do the dishes because I broke my leg, you know, and making that change. So it's a very important thing to work on, and you could be seeing any number of different things when a client is lying to you about anything, including their current use. I remember a woman I worked with years ago, and she had suffered a lot of abuse. She had engaged in some behaviors of which she disapproved. But as it turned out, she was hugely full of shame about having smoked pot. And she could not talk. She could talk about all these other things that were really profound that had happened, but she couldn't talk about that. And she lied about it for a long time before, you know, she became comfortable enough to open up to that. So yeah, it varies a lot. And Evie, you had another one also, I think. Was it?
Yes.
Or was it around, was it perfectionism?
Yeah, it was about working with particularly college students, but it could be anyone who are so perfectionistic in their lives, not alcoholics, but that perfectionism seems like an addiction itself.
It could be regarded as an addiction or an obsessive compulsive type tendency, but it particularly is the I am not good enough, which leads many people to addiction, because they're medicating the pain of not being good enough, or they're getting rid of the guilt and shame about the 90 that they got rather than 100, or the anticipation of this exam or this paper or this thing that they're going to do terrible at. And I see this all, you know, I'm working with one younger woman who just graduated with high grades, got a great job down in the city, and every single time an exam was coming up, I flunked or it came up, I flunked, and she never got less than a 95. And it's like, okay, what's that about? Yeah.
Imposter syndrome, I'm thinking about as you're talking about this, and I'm thinking about how so much of that shame and guilt and sense of worthlessness is a physical body thing. I'm wondering how much of that, because a lot of this is cognitive, and not all clients are in a place where they're healthy cognitively, their brains are damaged.
Right, and they have body dysmorphia. They just, no matter how thin they are, they're fat, or they're, you know, or they're unhealthy. The 12-step environment can be very helpful around these things, and there's a line in the big book, in this thing they call How It Works. There's a chapter titled How It Works, and that's actually where they have the 4th and the 5th step. And many meetings, they read the first page and a half of that chapter at the beginning of meetings. And there's a line in there about progress, not perfection. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has seriously followed a path. Those who cannot become people cannot or will not become completely honest with themselves. The other topic, and then it's about progress, not perfection. There's actually a book entitled The Spirituality of Imperfection, and it's about AA. I love the title. I'm not that keen on the book, but I think the title is awesome. Because the author keyed in on a very important part of addiction and recovery, which is I'm not good enough. And so when I'm not good enough, what do I do to deal with that? I try harder and harder and harder to be good enough. And I'm still not good enough, so people use. Now, other people develop other coping mechanisms, but addiction is the one that we're dealing with today of various types. And so one of the things that happens in I think really more in what they call the fellowship of AA, connecting with other people in recovery. You know, you're sitting there and it's your first day or first week or first month in recovery, and you've lost relationships and treated people poorly, and you've gotten 2 DWIs, and you just you're feeling bad. And then you hear these other people who you're observing. They're well dressed, they seem happy, they're connecting with people, and that's going on. And you're thinking, oh, I could hold that person with esteem. That person is happy, that person has it together. I like that person, they're competent. And then they say, well, I had 2 DWIs, I lost these relationships, I lost this job. And it helps you, again, shift out of the other space and get the unconscious sense that I don't have to be perfect, which is really essential for people to have inner peace, because none of us are perfect. But a lot of us don't deal well with that whole relationship, and even though we can talk about this intellectually, they don't feel it. They don't have that feeling of okayness, that thing that we call faith, because since they were this big, some told me, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough or tall enough or athletic enough or whatever it is, that they got into the I'm not, and so I am good enough. And not only am I not perfect, it is essential that I not be perfect. It's not just okay. It's like, it is, no one is perfect. I good. So that's really key, and it's huge. And the 12-step environment is really quite good for that. And one of the important things about that is the reinforcement of all of this stuff. Going back to the marathon runner thing, you don't want to cross the finish line and then sit down. What you have to do is on a daily basis, do what you need to do so you can be emotionally centered, so that you can stay good enough as you deal with the travails that we all go through in life and the stages of life, and starting a family, having the family go away, starting careers, ending careers, people dying, as we do that, like there's different things that need to be done. Okay, still good enough, rather than, now, if I were better, everything would be okay. No. Now, the details may vary, but the bad stuff is going to happen. The imperfections will come to the fore. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I feel like I'm stating the obvious, but it's not really the same. To me, this stuff applies to everybody, whether they have addiction issues or not. And I'm finding it really helpful. And I am putting a plug into, I'd like sometime to hear your thoughts on, accepting self as is, or finding a blessed home in yourself, or as I see it, my work, to me, people that suffer the most don't have a connection to themselves, but they're always looking at that person has whatever that person has, money, spouse, or career, and I don't have those things.
And that's well put, and it's true. And a lot of people in 12-step programs think that everybody ought to be in them, and I think there's merit to that. They're very sound principles that have been around for thousands of years. They were just put together by people in a certain way that is helpful. I told someone at lunchtime, I'm mostly a Buddhist. And the Buddhists have the Dharma and the Sangha. They have the truth or the teachings and the community. The 12-step people have the program and the fellowship. Same idea, 2,500 years apart. And the idea is that the Buddhists have is you need people to talk about this stuff. You need like-minded people, the running group. You have, it's like, oh yeah, they're interested in the same thing I'm interested in. They understand the concepts. They see the way I frame things. I can touch base. I can get some expert advice. I can get some support when I screwed up my leg. You want that, and the 12-step stuff has that. Now, a lot of churches, a lot of religions have that, and they have that community. Some of the religious communities aren't quite as connected as they once were, both because people live farther apart and they're doing by cars and the culture is broken down. And there's probably other reasons too, but I think that the recovering community is inclined to give a lot more support than most things these days. And that is really important, especially with sort of the ongoing maintenance of this. You know, one of the things that I say is recovery is not an intellectual exercise. We're doing cognitive behavioral therapy. So the cognitive part, your education and insights, there's an intellectual piece there, there's a cognitive piece there. Well, the insights are essential, but they're seldom sufficient. And we got to get to these other things. You've got to get to, what do I need to do to get back to center today when I don't have money for the rent? Or, you know, my boss is being a jerk, or I have to go see my parents, you know, whatever it may be for an individual. And so that fits in this, the externals. You know, when I'm saying I'm not good enough, I'm comparing myself to everybody else. So it fits in with exactly what you're saying. And what I want, just like that says, I want my inner peace to not be dependent on the way I compare myself to everything else or everyone else or what I think they're thinking of me. And that is much easier said than done. And a lot of these things, it's hard to help people understand them enough to help them value the idea of trying to work on it. I teach a lot of people meditation, and it's like, yeah, sure, that's way too simple to be helpful. And and the fact is, if you don't do it, it's not going to help. So it can be very self-fulfilling. Okay, this is the 8th step. Where any other questions first? Or comments? Made a list of all the persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Seems very simple. You write stuff down and you say, okay, I'll do it. There's some more interesting aspects to it. Step 8 and 9 are concerned with personal relationships. First, we take a look backward and try to discover where have we been at fault. Next, we make a vigorous attempt to repair the damage we have done. And third, having thus cleared away the debris of the past, we consider how, with our newfound knowledge of ourselves, we may develop the best possible relations with every human being we know. And that's the type of thing that you always think of when you think of crackheads, right? You know, they're really concerned with personal relationships, and they're really concerned. No, I'm joking. Recovery has a lot to do with changing all of these things. And this is obscure. This is not something that somebody that's going into rehab for the first day or coming into our offices for the first day or starting a 12-step program are thinking is relevant. I mean, it doesn't even hit the horizon. But if we don't have decent relationships with people, we're going to be carrying around shame and guilt and anxiety and anger and resentment. And that anxiety has to do with the fear of what other people, oh, I mean, I took that from them. And so I can't go there anymore, and they hate me, and I'm bad, and all this stuff is going on all the time. So steps 8 and 9, it has to, you make the list, and then eventually we get to 9 where you make the amends. But there's an interesting aspect to the 8th step that's lost on most people, including a lot of people in 12-step programs. And that is, we've made this list. I stole this, I lied about this, I think Bill Wilson had one about padding the expense account. Maybe I was not totally true in a relationship, something like that. There's all sorts of things that I feel shame, guilt, or anxiety about. I need to clean those up. So you make the list, and a lot of this list comes out of the 4th step. You've got your resentment list. What you're going to find is a lot of people on that list, although we hated them and everything was their fault, it turns out everything wasn't their fault, and I really treated them poorly, and I need to make amends. Now, it's important when we think about this making amends concept to realize that to make amends means to repair. It doesn't necessarily mean to apologize, although quite often an apology is part of it. But it's to repair. How do I repair this relationship? And sometimes we're actually able to repair a relationship and heal it and have a lovely relationship going forward, maybe a developing nice relationship over time, maybe something instantaneous. All that was needed was an acknowledgement for the negative feelings for the other person to change. It certainly varies a lot. But sometimes the way to make an amends is to never go there again. You know, sometimes it's to, you know, not have contact. And so that's one of the reasons they recommend you have a sponsor. And I always recommend to people that 8 and 9 are steps you don't do unless you have a sponsor or a therapist that knows 12-step stuff. Because you don't want to be doing amends too soon. And the easiest one, and I think it's on the next slide, is you don't want to be doing an amends with somebody or a 9th step with somebody when you're not really pretty darn certain you're done using. And one of the things you'll hear from people in recovery is no one ever wanted to hear me say I'm sorry again, because I said I was sorry so many times and then I did it again. And so there's a huge change required for this to have the benefits that you want, and you don't want to be premature in it. And so that's, and a lot of people when they first get in recovery, like they're so excited about all the change that they just want to boom, 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 go through everything. It's best to slow them down and say, let's work on 4 and 5 a while longer. Let's work on 6 and 7 and go slow. But the part that I'm thinking of that isn't as obvious about the 8th step, we made a list of all the persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. An important aspect of this is to not be moving towards your 9th step driven by fear. If I don't do this, this is never going to heal. I'm never going to get my parents back. I'm never going to get my girlfriend back. I'm never going to get the job back if I don't go do this. That is being driven by fear. We do not want to be driven by fear even in doing the steps. And this can often be lost. And the flip side of it is to not being motivated to do it is to coming up with excuses of why not to, because of this, that, and the other. So it's a good idea to have sponsors, trusted advisors, therapists to help you see really where you are with this stuff, rather than being sort of lost in our head with the magic story of how everything's going to be perfect from now on or nothing's ever going to be okay again, depending on your particular mood that day. So that's the 8th. While the purpose of making restitutions to others is paramount, it is equally necessary that we extricate from an examination of our personal relations every bit of information about ourselves and our fundamental difficulties that we can, since defective relations with other human beings have nearly always been the immediate causes of woe, including our alcoholism. No field of investigation could yield more satisfying and valuable rewards than this one. Calm, thoughtful reflection upon personal relations can deepen our insight. Sounds like it was written by a therapist, doesn't it? We can go far beyond these things which were superficially wrong with us to see those flaws which were basic, flaws which sometimes were responsible for the whole patterns of our lives. Thoroughness, we have found, will pay and pay handsomely. I regard that as a really insightful thing from a failed stockbroker. And I think it's true. Once again, a lot of our addiction has to do with, Dad didn't love me. Mom wasn't there for me. This thing, and my first girlfriend dumped me. And there it all started, and I started developing these patterns of behaviors, these methods of self-care that didn't work well, and I told myself stories about them that were not accurate. And so, this type thing, this 6, 7, 8, and 9, it evolves over a period of time. These insights that they're talking about in this really would probably come about more likely. You do your 8th and 9th step, but then you remain open, like they call it in the 6th and 7th step. to continue to gain self-awareness about, oh yeah, this is another manifestation of that particular thing over here. Like, you know, my fear of women's anger, oh, that manifests in my fear of getting projects done by the deadline. And you start seeing deeper and deeper, and you become more and more skillful in more and more different environments to be able to more quickly identify what's going on for you emotionally, and then get back to emotional center, and then your centered, balanced self can make your decisions and control your behaviors. That's another thing that I say, is I don't want your fearful, angry self making your decisions and controlling your behaviors. I want your centered, balanced self making your decisions and controlling your behaviors. So one way to look about what we're doing is to become more and more competent at seeing when you're tipped over. And instead of trying to fix whatever needs to be fixed in order to get okay, first you get okay, and then you fix whatever needs to be fixed. It's a profound change for most people. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions on the 8th? The 9th step. May direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. I think the insight about except when to do so would injure them or others came about because of Bill's foibles, his own awareness of his stuff as he became more and more sober over time. And I think it's a very good advice. When you go to repair things, you can sometimes make things worse. And one of the things that is true is it really isn't correct for me to make myself feel better at your expense. And so part of this is, how do I do that? How do I, somebody I treated poorly in the past, how do I own my stuff and express, really repent what I've done? You know, how do I do that in a way that doesn't cause more damage than it does healing? And talking with therapists and trusted advisors that have a clue. Not everyone in 12-step programs does have a clue, but a lot do. You know, how do I do it? And you can get in all sorts of trouble. There actually is, there's a story in the paper 5 or 6 years ago about a man that had date raped someone in college, and he felt terrible about it after he got sober. And he was working the steps, and he found the person, and he did what he could to make amends, to apologize, to take ownership and apologize. And she thanked him and had him arrested, and he spent 7 years in jail. That was not his intention. To get himself put in jail. And interestingly, back in the, I think it was 49 that the 12 and 12 came out, they actually have the example, is it fair to your family if you make it, by your making amends, you are no longer employable and you can no longer feed your family? How do you weigh the ethics of that sort of thing? And I think the answer is the accountant's answer, and the accountant's answer is always, it depends. It is very particular, it's very personal, and it needs to be worked with closely with a skilled therapist, a skilled advisor, so you can figure out what's motivating you to do what you think you need to do, and what are the implications and costs to the various players involved. After we've made the list of people we have harmed, have reflected carefully upon each instance, and have tried to possess ourselves of the right attitude in which to proceed, we will see that the making of direct amends divides those we should approach into several classes. There will be those who ought to be dealt with just as soon as we can be reasonably confident that we can maintain our sobriety. There will be those to whom we can only make partial restitution, less complete disclosure, do them or others more harm than good. There will be other cases where action ought to be deferred, and others in which, by the very nature of the situation, we shall never be able to make direct personal contact at all, such as if people have passed away, or there's other circumstances that you can imagine could lead to that. And so there's a lot of people, they padded an expense. Yeah, Tricia.
I've had clients write their insights on paper and then burn, and it seems to
So Tricia was mentioning that she's had clients write their amends on paper and then burn the paper, and that has been helpful. That's a great suggestion. One that I know of that people have done is they've ripped off somebody, and maybe it's if they own up to it, they won't be employable, and they've got small kids, and it really wouldn't be beneficial to not be employable. What is often recommended is make donations to charities that fit in and are appropriate, and do it to the degree that matters. Like if you're making $100,000 a year, donating $100 probably isn't sufficient to really represent an amends. But some larger sum that actually makes it so you don't get to go on vacation or buy the car or whatever it is, that would be the type of thing. Because what we're trying to do again is shift the feelings. We're trying to make it so people aren't driven by guilt, shame, and anxiety, or anger and resentment. And so coming up with a strategy and tactics to do that is what we're trying to do. So does this seem like a good idea for most people? Yeah, Nancy?
I'm really struck by what a profound process this is, and it requires a lot of emotional risk. And I'm wondering about the sponsors, because it sounds like they're really critical on it. What is that process for becoming a sponsor?
Unfortunately, there is none. Thank you. I appreciate that. What Nancy asked is, what's the process for becoming a sponsor? So there's a lot of really profound things going on here with a lot of potential risks. How do you do this in a way that has some competency or some likelihood of getting the desired outcomes? And so, what's the process for people becoming sponsors? And the answer is there really is none. Although if you were to be going to 12-step meetings, the old timers would be talking about, well, my sponsor took me through the steps, and they read every page of the big book with me, and they made me look up the definition of every single word, which sometimes happens. Now, the interesting thing is when people do that, they sometimes come to understand what it's all about. But other times, even though they've done all those things, they haven't come to understand it because of their personality or their particular background or things like that. So there is no guarantee. There are people in 12-step programs that are incredibly insightful and intuitive, in loving and compassionate. There's others that they're not so intuitive, but they're just loving and compassionate, and that sort of carries the day. There's others that it's like, we're into tough love here. I don't want to be an enabler. And that can help people, especially early on, to help them get started. It's not what I see as being most beneficial. It is one thing that I think that when I'm working with people, let's say they've come to me, they've got a problem, and they've decided to get into recovery, and they started doing 12-step work, they've stopped using, and they've started doing the steps. I always tell people, if you have a choice between seeing me and going to AA, go to AA. It's free, you can do it every day. You can get a lot of support. What would take 2 or 3 years in my office, maybe longer, you can accomplish in 3 or 6 months in a 12-step program, if you're lucky. But what I can do often is help translate and help sort of redirect people. If somebody over here is giving a sort of advice that isn't terribly helpful, I can identify it as not helpful with some confidence, whereas they're sitting there going, is this just me not being able to do this AA thing again too? I'm a failure at that, just like everything else. So I can do some translation, I can do some guiding, and I can give some support, which is really helpful, especially early on. And I can be a countervailing presence to the less helpful sponsors or group members. There was a guy a few years ago in Ithaca AA who was from another state, and he'd come up here part of the time, and he was a militant big book thumper. And this isn't a very good selling point for AA, but oh, what the hell. But he was a big book thumper, and it's all in the book, and we don't talk about this, and we don't talk about that. It's just it. And I always knew when he came in town, because my clients would become suicidal. And he's no longer coming to town, as far as I know. No one used over, but I do know people that left meetings because he talked, and he had the ability to shame people. Unintentionally, I'm sure. I'm sure he had a great heart. That's why they say, hurt people, hurt people. And he thought he had the message, but all he had was the words. And that can happen. And as a therapist, we can help our clients. No, it's not you. You're not doing anything wrong. This guy is just wounded in a way that he doesn't know he's wounded. So, he's not probably intentionally trying to hurt people, and he wasn't. He just didn't know how to do any better than he was doing, and he had a large influence. I see two hands, so I saw that one first.
Isn't that what used to be called a dry drunk sometimes?
That could fit in with the concept of dry drunk, yeah. For those we talk about emotional sobriety, and we talk about dry drunks. So earlier on, I said, being abstinent, so when you're no longer using, and being sober is when you're not ticked off about it anymore. And a dry drunk, they're abstinent, generally, although you will sometimes find people that are just trying to control their drinking, fit all the criteria of what's called a dry drunk. I mean, because they are always thinking about, when can I have my second of my 2 drinks today? And it's like,
I think recovering addicts are especially sensitive, confusing with that kind of.
yeah.
I think too, for the sponsorship dilemma, the program does have some suggestions built in that help, like your sponsor should have a sponsor, your sponsor should have at least a year sober and have worked either the 4th step or all the steps, and you should have more than just your sponsor in your support network. And while that doesn't solve all the problems 100%, it does provide some safeguards.
It really does, and there are a lot of groups that are really good about mentioning those things and helping people with that. There's, as I talk about all this stuff, I do want to present both sides of the equation, because I would rather have people hearing about the negative aspects of 12-step stuff from me rather than from a client, and have it color your sense of 12-step programs. It's amazing how much love and caring there is in 12-step stuff. It's amazing to see, these guys that, they were like, tough street fighting biker rednecks sitting down with these, sweet little lesbian women, and they love each other. And they're helping each other. They never ever would have talked about anything, and they would do anything for each other. It's really quite impressive, but it's not always the case.
Yeah. Any resources that you know of that specifically, maybe this is doing you out of a job, but so talking about the kinds of things to help people understand the balances to be aware of. So basically, what we're talking about here. Things to be aware of, because so many people are in the rooms of AA and don't know what, we talked about this already, what is right, what is for me, am I not doing this right, whatever. Ways to kind of step back and assess. And if it's not coming from a sponsor, he's got a year, or he has their own sponsor, blah, blah, blah. Are there any resources that go there?
Not put there, other than therapists, not really. One of the sayings, and it's in the AA literature, is our code is love and tolerance, which is a great code. Now, personally, I try and aim a little bit higher than that. I think that a better code is love and compassion. And the reason I think that is when you are being tolerant, someone is irritating you, but you're keeping your mouth shut. And that's good. You're not making a situation worse when you are refraining from being judgmental, overtly judgmental or critical or this and that. But it's even better when you get to a point of love and compassion, you're no longer feeling irritated. You're able to actually quickly move from that irritated space to, oh, this person is hurting, and I don't need to be insulted. I don't need to take it personally. And there are a lot of people in recovery in the 12-step environment that are living based on love and compassion, sometimes consciously, quite often unconsciously. And there's others that they're not quite as skillful at the tolerance as we would hope that they would be. But still, it's a much higher standard of acceptance than you see in most arenas in the world these days. Okay. Now the 10th step. Let's see, we'll take a break at 2. So the last 3 steps, 10, 11, and 12, are regarded as the daily steps of AA. And I think that that's true. If a person is inclined to do the things in 10, 11, and 12 on a regular basis, they're going to be less stressed out than if they don't. And I pretty much am comfortable guaranteeing that to people that are doing it. As a footnote, just because it's of interest to me, there are a lot of people in AA that say or NA or OA that say you have to do the steps in order. It's sort of a common thing. The old timers, we always did it in order. I don't think anybody does the 12 steps in order, even including the people that say you have to do the steps in order, because they mostly, most of them get step 1, and then pretty quickly on start doing 11 and 12, which we'll get to in a minute, and then they circle back around to 2 and 3. And they get those feeling changes, the hopelessness changes some hope, and they start doing, I'll do the 4 and 5. And then they may work their way up through directly. But number 10 is something that people get to do every day. At least most people get to do every day, simply because they're imperfect. Continue to take a personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Now, I don't know about you, but I make mistakes every day. When a drunk has a terrific hangover because he drank heavily yesterday, he cannot live well today. But there's another kind of hangover which we all experience whether we are drinking or not. That is the emotional hangover. Anybody ever had one of those? Yeah. The direct result of yesterday's and sometimes today's excess of negative emotion. Anger, fear, jealousy, and the like. If we would live serenely today and tomorrow, we certainly need to eliminate these hangovers. This doesn't mean we need to wander around morbidly in the past. It requires an admission and correction of errors now. Our inventory enables us to settle with the past. When this is done, we are really able to leave it behind us. When our inventory is carefully taken and we have made peace with ourselves, the conviction follows that tomorrow's challenges can be met as they come. This is, once again, I think, one of their the 12-step, the early AA's sort of brilliant intuitive insights. Remember my 3 things: live in the present, bring your life into your conscious awareness, and stop leading a fear-based life. If you do those things, you're not going to be spending as much anger or as much time in anger or resentment or guilt and shame for days or weeks on end. And that's critically important. Has anybody here ever been rude to somebody? I don't like being rude. Basically, I'm sort of a nice guy generally, but I can blow it. Interestingly, I have come to believe that when I blow it, it's generally driven by fear. And that may seem like overstated, but I'll give you an example. I'm at Weggies. I'm standing in line, and being the nice guy that I am, I let this little old lady go ahead of me. She only has a couple of things. I got a shopping cart. I said, go ahead. You know, look, I'm a nice guy. Go ahead. And she gets ahead of me, and then, the clerk, the guy, rings up the first things. Oh, I forgot. I got to get one more thing. She leaves the line. Now, the register is locked now on her. Can't do it. We have to wait for her. Then she comes back, and, oh, sorry. And I'm fine. I'm good. It's not a problem. And then she brings out coupons, and they're expired. And then her credit card doesn't work, and she doesn't have ID for the check, and I'm fine. And then all of a sudden, I'm not fine. What happened? I went from fine to not fine. I'm a nice guy. What happened was I have an appointment in 15 minutes across town, and if I don't get there on time, I'm going to lose a contract, or somebody's going to think I don't respect them, or somebody thinks I'm a flake, and going back to that humility thing, all those things that I'm thinking about what other people are thinking about me. And I go to the clerk, and I'm pissy. And I'm right, because clearly, he didn't do a good enough job, getting stuff through. And I am not aware that what happened was I got afraid. And anger is secondary to the fear. So I jumped over the fear, I got to the anger, and people got to observe that anger. And then I go off with my groceries, mumbling about how I shouldn't have done that, but it was really okay because it was, their fault. But I'm feeling a bit guilty and a bit. Now, in the old days, for the drinkers and the drug addict, they make a scene in a bar one night. They don't go back to that bar for a month, until things blow over, because they're feeling guilt and shame and maybe in trouble, maybe. But today it still continues with that. So a 10th step, and the 12-step people actually recommend that you attend to as soon as possible, and they recommend at the end of the day actually going through the things you've done well and poorly in the day, and sort of making a list of any of these little sins that were committed, and basically going back around to the clerk and say, there's 3 parts to a clean 10th step. I'm sorry. That's the first part. The second part and the third part are critical. The second part, it was my fault. It's not, I'm sorry, I wouldn't have been rude if you weren't so damn slow. Okay? That's not an apology. That is a pseudo-apology. That is blaming my bad behavior on another person. That's not the idea. And the third part, which every active addict ignores or is not able to follow through on it, and that is, I will do everything I can to not do that again. And that is key to having inner peace and equanimity and long-term emotional growth. You take ownership. You say, what was, I got afraid. I was afraid of that I was going to miss that appointment. I was afraid that the doors were going to lock. And you gain this self-awareness, and you no longer react to the billboard picture of the bus as if you're getting hit by a bus. But the only way you stop reacting to everything is as if it's a crisis, is if you develop the competency to be able to tell the difference. The only way you're going to develop that competency is if you work on it regularly, that number 5, the healthy discipline. Knowledge, skills, competencies, capacities, and healthy discipline. So you sort of plug away at it. Yeah.
So I'm curious, with that example, when we were talking earlier about kind of perfectionism, where's the balance with kind of I maybe blew up at the clerk versus maybe somebody who doesn't have a great balance of knowing I just look sideways at somebody, or I don't know how to ask it in maybe a really eloquent way, but just kind of that thought of in your example, it's I blew up at the clerk, and I yelled at them and told them they were slow or something, and then coming back around to apologize. But I noticed with college students, our population that we're working with, sometimes they're well, I was really mean to the person, or you kind of ask, and they're well, I looked at them sideways, and I could tell if I really like looked at them meanly. And to me, like to kind of, how do you, or what is the balance there?
Well, in that instance, I would say, when you looked at that person with a mean look, what was going through your head? What were you thinking? Well, I was thinking that they were idiots. Or I was thinking I was going to be late for class because, they're standing there talking in the middle of the hall, blocking the whole thing. And what you do is you help people try and figure out what the thought process is, what the feelings were that were attached prior to the ugly look or the pot shot or whatever it is, so that they can gain self-awareness. And because the development of self-awareness is really instrumental in all this stuff, especially over time. And when we go, oh, okay, I realize this because that person was a jerk to me last Friday night, or he took my girlfriend, or she took my girlfriend, or what. And then, that's what was going on. It didn't have anything to do with being late. It had to do that this was a personal insult. And you help them keep gaining those self-awarenesses. And basically the way I think about it is I want to be helping the people only experience events as crises that are actual crises. And changing that makes a huge change for most people, because most people are out there overreacting to almost everything. And deep.
I think that's where it comes into like why, that thought of like, if they believe it's a crisis, right, in some ways,
Yes.
it's a crisis for them.
Well, it
yeah,
is,
and
yeah.
then kind of like our job is going to be like, okay, like probably similar to the last step, like tracking down that person that you didn't know, that you gave a nasty look to the other day to say sorry, might do more harm.
Yeah, that can be
than
overdone.
good, but the self-awareness is
Yeah.
there.
It's the self-awareness in the long run we're after. And you can always say, you can do an anonymous 10th step, make a donation to their club or their team or something like that, rather than, that's hunting people down can lead to problems. Yeah.
So along those lines, is it also important that when you're making amends to someone, that you don't expect a response necessarily?
Oh, so Yvonne asks, isn't it important when making amends to not be expecting a certain response or even any response? That is a profoundly important aspect to the 9th and the 10th steps. And quite honestly, a lot of people, a year after they've done a 9th step with their ex-spouse or girlfriend or boyfriend, gain a whole lot more awareness of what their actual motivation was versus the motivation they told themselves at the time. Which doesn't mean it was awful of what they did, but as we evolve and gain more self-awareness. But a classic thing would be making an amends to an old lover in order to make him a new lover. That is not the recommended idea. And if that was happening for a person, there's a very good chance they wouldn't be aware of it. Now, if you have somebody that's more narcissistic, a sociopath in it, they might be aware of it. But for most people, that wouldn't be it. But they're blind to what's going on, or at least they're able to repress, suppress, deny, or rationalize the story they're telling themselves about why they want to do it. So you want to be clear, what's my intention for talking to my ex-boss about this, or my ex-wife about this, or this and that. And sometimes you will be hated. The only amends you can make to me is never darken my doorstep again. Now, some people may go use over that response, but the idea is I've cleaned my side of the street. I really can't see where they're coming from, or I can see where they're coming from, but that's it. And like in the short term, a key thing to do is like be connected with other sober people or your therapist or whatever, so you can do what you need to do to dissipate those negative feelings until you get back to center and balance.
So delicate.
It can. A lot of this is powerful stuff. The 4th step is very powerful. And as a matter of fact, as a therapist, I think it's good to recommend to people, once you've done your 4th step, do your 5th step as quickly as you can. Because if you're remembering things in which you have a lot of guilt and shame, and they've all come into your consciousness in the past 2 weeks or month while you've been working on it, it can be a problem. So it's better, and same thing with the 8th and the 9th step is to be working with somebody and have support. The women in Ithaca AA are doing really well with this, and I think it's okay for me to talk about it. But they're doing a thorough job. Saying, you've got this amends to make to your ex. Now write out what you're going to say. Everything you're going to say, run it by me before you say it. Come up with a time, and they're go drive to the other city and do it, and they're all staying connected while they're doing it, and a lot of good outcomes are coming about as a result of it. But there's a lot of support and connection there, and a lot of that continuity that you were talking about, having a sponsor, and really going through the book and sort of reading these paragraphs. They go, oh, there's a lot of stuff in there, and start really understanding the concepts rather than, well, I think I need to do a 9th step with that person. This goes on for a while longer. I think there's another one after this too. Aren't these practices joy killers as well as time consumers? Must AAs spend most of their waking hours drearily rehashing their sins of omission and commission? Well, hardly. The emphasis on inventory is heavy only because a great many of us have never really acquired the habit of accurate self-appraisal. I think that one may be true for most people. Once this healthy practice has become grooved, it will be so interesting and profitable that the time it takes won't be missed. For these minutes and sometimes hours spent in self-examination are bound to make all the other hours of our day better and happier. And at length, our inventories become a regular part of everyday living rather than something unusual or set apart. So, being mostly Buddhist, and being a long-time meditator. One of the things, if you get into that a lot, one of the things you've eventually come to realize is the idea is to have your entire life become a meditation. It's not to have meditation in your life, or for other reasons, not to have going to church be separate from all the rest of your life. It's it's really supposed to be one thing. And as you do these things and you develop these habits, it just becomes a part of what goes on, and you sort of instinctively, oh, I was just a jerk, I need to go clean that. And there's no big thought process required any more than, when you park your car, you need to put in a quarter or get Parkmobile and take care of that. So I think that's really important. It's not a killjoy, and it's not something, people in recovery do not spend all their days thinking about being in recovery, or thinking about, oh God, I hope I don't drink, or thinking about I need to do this or that step. Generally speaking, you will find some people that the whole 12-step thing can become obsessive compulsive. Again, that's an extreme minority. Few people have been more victimized by resentments than have we alcoholics. It mattered little whether our resentments were justified or not. A burst of temper could spoil a day, and a well-nursed grudge could make us miserably ineffective. Nor were we ever skillful in separating justified from unjustified anger. As we saw it, our wrath was always justified. Anger, that occasional luxury of more balanced people, could keep us on an emotional jag indefinitely. These emotional dry benders often led straight to the bottle. Other kinds of disturbances, jealousy, envy, self-pity, or hurt pride did the same thing. How many people here do couples work? Yeah. You ever deal with any of these issues when dealing with couples? And yeah, these are the things that create problems for us. It's pretty easy to, especially these days with cell phones. I don't even know how many clients I've had that they've showed up because somebody saw something on somebody else's cell phone, and it is never going to be okay, and it is the other person's fault. And I have never done anything like that. Oh, geez, maybe I have. So this type of stuff, going back to what you said about, this would be beneficial for everybody. We're dealing with things that are very common in the 12-step arrangement. is really helpful for people to let go of the tendency to get hurt and then get angry, and then over time have it turn into resentment, and then have it so the other person never has a chance to be right again. I mean, this happened in couples counseling, when generally, when I'm working with couples, when they come in the first time, I'll ask both. I said, I'm going to ask you both the same question, and we flip a coin to see who goes first, and and that's, how come you're here? And I apologize for the stereotype, but it helps stories. Stereotypically, the guy will say, well, we don't have sex anymore. And the gal will say, well, he's never around. He doesn't pay any attention to me. He's always off watching football or doing this. He's never around. And then we talk for a while longer about what really is going on. And what it turns out is somebody hurt somebody's feelings 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. Somebody got drunk, or somebody spent some money they shouldn't have spent, or somebody cheated on somebody, something happened. Somebody made a decision that should have involved both. So there was the aggrieved and the perpetrator of the original sin. And that problem has never been resolved. It quite often has never been discussed, and then there's been a piling on for 5, 10, or 20 years. And the work is to get back quite often to the original thing. But critically, it's also to get to a point where each can forgive the other. Because the first person did the thing that was wrong. He got drunk, and then she got cranky. And he felt that she was being unfair and unkind always. And she was being unfair and unkind, but she didn't know why she was being unkind, because she was hurt that he had done that thing before. And so he in turn did it, and so this 12-step stuff is very handy for helping people unravel that stuff. And people that end up with addictions generally have done a lot of that type thing that needs cleaning up and resolving. So there's the cleaning up of the mess from before, and then developing the competency to not recreate the same messes going forward in the future. That's a good place. Let's take a break.